The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Fallujah as Captain Sarah Martinez adjusted her body armor for what would be her final patrol in this war-torn city. She had been deployed to Iraq for 8 months, serving as a military intelligence officer with the 82nd Airborne Division. Her job was to gather information about insurgent activities and help coordinate operations to bring peace to this volatile region. Sarah never imagined she would end up in combat zones when she first joined the Army 6 years earlier. She had grown up in a small town in Texas, the daughter of a high school principal and a nurse. Her parents had always encouraged her to pursue education and service, values that led her to West Point and eventually to this dangerous assignment in Iraq. The intelligence reports that morning indicated increased insurgent activity in the Al-Anbar province. Sarah's unit was tasked with conducting a routine patrol through a neighborhood that had seen several attacks in recent weeks. The mission seemed straightforward: check on local families, gather information about suspicious activities, and maintain a visible presence to deter insurgent operations. As their convoy of armored vehicles moved through the narrow streets, Sarah reviewed her notes from previous patrols. She had built relationships with several local families who provided valuable intelligence about insurgent movements. These connections were crucial for understanding the complex dynamics of the neighborhood and identifying potential threats. The first stop was at the home of an elderly man named Abbas, who ran a small shop and had children and grandchildren living nearby. Abbas had been helpful in previous meetings, sharing information about strangers in the area and unusual activities. Sarah approached his door with her translator, a young Iraqi man named Omar who had worked with American forces for over a year. Abbas greeted them warmly and invited them inside for tea, a gesture of hospitality that had become routine during their visits. He shared information about recent developments in the neighborhood, including the arrival of several men who had been asking questions about American patrol routes and schedules. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of gunfire in the distance. Sarah's radio crackled with reports from other units in the area, indicating that insurgents had initiated contact with American forces several blocks away. The situation was escalating quickly, and Sarah's commanding officer ordered her team to return to their vehicles and assist with the developing firefight. As they prepared to leave Abbas's house, the elderly man grabbed Sarah's arm and spoke urgently to Omar in Arabic. The translator's expression grew serious as he listened to Abbas's words. Omar turned to Sarah and explained that Abbas had received information about an ambush being planned for American forces in this exact area. The warning came too late. As Sarah's team emerged from the house and moved toward their vehicles, the sound of automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple directions. Insurgents had positioned themselves in buildings surrounding the small courtyard where the American vehicles were parked. The attack was coordinated and well-planned, designed to trap the patrol team in a confined area with limited escape routes. Sarah immediately took cover behind a concrete wall and began returning fire with her M4 rifle. Her training kicked in as she assessed the situation and tried to coordinate her team's response. The insurgents were firing from elevated positions in nearby buildings, giving them a significant tactical advantage over the Americans in the courtyard below. The firefight intensified as more insurgents joined the attack. Bullets struck the walls around Sarah's position, sending concrete fragments flying through the air. She could hear her teammates calling for air support and reinforcements over the radio, but knew that help would take time to arrive in this remote part of the city. During a brief lull in the gunfire, Sarah attempted to move to a better defensive position that would allow her to protect her translator and provide covering fire for her teammates. As she sprinted across the open courtyard, multiple shots rang out simultaneously from different buildings surrounding her position. The first bullet struck her in the left shoulder, spinning her around and causing her to stumble. The second hit her in the chest, but her body armor absorbed most of the impact. The third and fourth bullets hit her legs, causing her to fall to the ground near the center of the courtyard. Despite her wounds, Sarah continued to return fire from her prone position. Her military training had prepared her for situations like this, and her primary focus was on protecting her team members and completing the mission. She could feel blood soaking through her uniform, but adrenaline kept her alert and fighting. More shots followed in rapid succession. The fifth bullet grazed her head, leaving a deep cut along her scalp. The sixth and seventh struck her arms, making it difficult to maintain her grip on her rifle. The eighth bullet hit her in the back, and the ninth struck her abdomen, causing severe internal damage. The 10th bullet shattered her left leg bone, and the final shot hit her in the chest again, this time finding a gap in her body armor. Sarah felt her strength leaving her as she lay motionless in the dusty courtyard, surrounded by the continuing sounds of battle. Her teammates were pinned down behind their vehicles and unable to reach her position due to the intense enemy fire. They could see her lying motionless in the center of the courtyard and feared the worst. The insurgents continued their attack, making it impossible for anyone to attempt a rescue. Omar, the translator, had taken cover inside Abbas's house when the shooting started. He watched through a window as Sarah fell and remained still on the ground. The sight of her motionless form filled him with grief and guilt, knowing that he had been unable to protect the American officer who had treated him with respect and kindness during their months of working together. The firefight continued for another 30 minutes before reinforcements arrived and forced the insurgents to withdraw. American forces quickly secured the area and began treating the wounded. When medics finally reached Sarah's position, they found her unconscious and unresponsive, with multiple gunshot wounds and significant blood loss. The field medic checked for vital signs and found them extremely weak. Sarah's pulse was barely detectable, and her breathing was shallow and irregular. Based on the severity of her wounds and the amount of blood loss, the medic made the difficult assessment that she was unlikely to survive transport to the medical facility. Sarah's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel James Rodriguez, arrived at the scene as medics were evaluating her condition. Rodriguez had known Sarah for over 2 years and respected her dedication and skill as an intelligence officer. The sight of her motionless form in the courtyard was devastating for him and for the other members of their unit. The decision was made to transport Sarah to the forward operating base's medical facility, even though her chances of survival seemed minimal. The medics worked frantically to stabilize her condition during the helicopter ride, administering blood transfusions and emergency medications to keep her alive. At the medical facility, military doctors worked for hours attempting to repair the damage from her multiple gunshot wounds. The injuries were extensive and life-threatening, affecting multiple organ systems and causing massive internal bleeding. Despite their best efforts, Sarah remained unconscious and in critical condition. After 12 hours of surgery, the medical team made the devastating conclusion that Sarah's injuries were too severe for her to survive. Her brain activity had decreased significantly, and her body was failing to respond to treatment. The doctors informed Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez that Sarah had only hours left to live. The news spread quickly through the forward operating base. Sarah had been popular among her fellow soldiers, known for her intelligence, humor, and dedication to her mission. Many of her colleagues came to pay their respects, sharing stories of her kindness and professionalism during their deployment. Omar, the translator, was particularly devastated by the news. He blamed himself for not warning the patrol team about the ambush sooner, even though he had received Abbas's information only moments before the attack began. The guilt weighed heavily on him as he thought about Sarah's family back in Texas, who would soon receive the terrible news of her death. Preparations began for transporting Sarah's body back to the United States. Her personal effects were collected and prepared for shipment to her family. Letters were written to her parents, explaining the circumstances of her death and honoring her service and sacrifice. The insurgent attack that claimed Sarah's life was part of a larger pattern of violence that had plagued Fallujah for months. Intelligence reports indicated that enemy forces had been planning coordinated attacks against American patrols, using detailed knowledge of their routes and schedules to set up deadly ambushes. Sarah's death was officially recorded in military records, and her name was added to the growing list of American service members who had made the ultimate sacrifice in Iraq. Her commanding officer began the process of recommending her for posthumous military honors, recognizing her bravery and dedication during her final patrol. The medical facility prepared Sarah's body for transport, following established military protocols for handling fallen soldiers. Her remains were placed in a flag-draped coffin and prepared for the long journey back to Dover Air Force Base in Delaware, where her family would finally be able to say goodbye. News of Sarah's death reached her parents in Texas through an official military notification team. Her mother collapsed upon hearing the news, while her father struggled to comprehend how their daughter's promising life had been cut short by enemy gunfire in a foreign land. The family began making arrangements for her funeral and burial with full military honors. Meanwhile, back in Fallujah, the area where Sarah had fallen was secured and marked as a crime scene for investigation. Military intelligence officers worked to identify the insurgents responsible for the attack and prevent similar ambushes in the future. The courtyard where Sarah had made her final stand became a sobering reminder of the dangers faced by American forces in Iraq. The insurgents who had carried out the attack melted back into the civilian population, making their identification and capture extremely difficult. They had achieved their objective of killing American soldiers and damaging morale among the troops stationed in Fallujah. As the sun set over Fallujah on the day of Sarah's death, her teammates held an informal memorial service at the forward operating base. They shared memories of her courage, her laugh, and her unwavering commitment to their mission. The loss of such a dedicated and respected officer was felt deeply throughout their unit. The official investigation into the attack revealed that the insurgents had used sophisticated planning and coordination to execute their ambush. They had observed American patrol patterns for weeks and chosen their positions carefully to maximize the damage they could inflict on the trapped soldiers. Sarah's body was loaded onto a military transport aircraft for the long journey home. The flag-draped coffin was treated with the highest respect and honor as it began its final trip to American soil. Her sacrifice would be remembered and honored, but the pain of her loss would remain with her family and fellow soldiers forever. The war in Iraq continued, with American forces working to bring stability and peace to the region. Sarah's death served as a stark reminder of the dangers faced by military personnel serving in combat zones and the price that freedom sometimes requires from those who volunteer to defend it. Sarah's consciousness returned slowly, like emerging from a deep underwater tunnel where sound and light seemed distant and distorted. The first sensation was pain, radiating through her body in waves that made it difficult to think clearly. Her mouth felt dry as sandpaper, and every breath seemed to require enormous effort. She tried to open her eyes, but the bright overhead lights of what appeared to be a medical facility caused intense pain in her head. Through blurred vision, she could see medical equipment around her, but something was wrong. The sounds she expected to hear in a busy military hospital were absent. Instead, there was an eerie silence broken only by the hum of machinery. Sarah attempted to move her arms, but found them restrained. Panic began to set in as she realized she couldn't feel her legs at all. Her training had taught her to assess her situation calmly, but the combination of pain, confusion, and immobility made rational thinking extremely difficult. As her vision gradually adjusted to the lighting, Sarah began to examine her surroundings more carefully. She was lying on a medical table in what appeared to be a makeshift field hospital or clinic. The equipment around her looked old and improvised. nothing like the advanced medical facilities she had seen at American military bases. The walls were made of concrete blocks, and the ceiling had water stains and cracks that suggested this building was in poor condition. Through a small window, she could see buildings that looked familiar from her patrols in Fallujah, but from an angle she had never seen before. Sarah's memory of recent events came back in fragments. She remembered the patrol, the visit to Abbas's house, and then the ambush. She could recall the sensation of being shot multiple times and falling in the courtyard. After that, everything became fuzzy and unclear. The realization that she was not in an American medical facility sent chills through her body. If she was in insurgent hands, her situation was far more dangerous than her physical injuries alone. American military personnel captured by enemy forces in Iraq often faced torture, execution, or use as bargaining chips in political negotiations. Sarah tried to speak but found that her throat was too dry and damaged to produce more than a whisper. She needed to understand where she was and who was holding her, but her current condition made it impossible to gather information effectively. Hours passed in silence. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, fighting to stay alert despite the pain medication that seemed to be flowing through an IV tube in her arm. During her lucid moments, she tried to listen for sounds that might give her clues about her location and captors. Eventually, she heard footsteps approaching from outside the room. The door opened, and a man entered wearing civilian clothes and carrying a medical bag. He appeared to be Middle Eastern, possibly Iraqi, and moved with the confidence of someone familiar with medical procedures. The man checked Sarah's pulse and examined her bandages without speaking. His touch was gentle and professional, suggesting he had medical training. Sarah tried to make eye contact with him, hoping to establish some form of communication, but he avoided looking directly at her face. After completing his examination, the man spoke to someone outside the room in Arabic. Sarah's language training allowed her to understand fragments of the conversation. They were discussing her condition and debating what to do with her. The tone suggested disagreement among her captors about her fate. Sarah closed her eyes and pretended to be unconscious while listening to the conversation. She learned that different factions within the insurgent group had different plans for her. Some wanted to use her as a bargaining chip to negotiate the release of insurgent prisoners. Others believed she should be executed as retaliation for American military actions in the area. The debate continued for several minutes before the voices moved away from the room. Sarah was left alone again, but now she had a better understanding of her precarious situation. Her survival depended not only on recovering from her injuries, but also on the internal politics of the group that was holding her. Over the next several hours, Sarah worked to regain her strength and assess her physical condition. The pain from her gunshot wounds was severe, but she could tell that she had received some medical treatment. Her wounds were bandaged, and the IV in her arm suggested that someone was making an effort to keep her alive. The fact that she was receiving medical care gave her hope that her captors had decided not to execute her immediately. However, she knew that her situation could change quickly, depending on developments in the broader conflict or pressure from other insurgent leaders. Sarah began to plan for different scenarios. If an opportunity for escape presented itself, she needed to be ready to act despite her injuries. If rescue was possible, she needed to find a way to signal her location to American forces. If neither option was available, she needed to prepare herself mentally for whatever her captors might do to her. The man with medical training returned several times throughout the day to check on her condition and change her bandages. Sarah noticed that he worked alone and seemed uncomfortable with the situation. She sensed that he was providing medical care reluctantly, possibly under orders from insurgent leaders. During one of his visits, Sarah managed to whisper a few words in Arabic, asking for water. The man looked surprised to hear her speak his language, but he brought her a cup of water and helped her drink. This small interaction gave Sarah hope that she might be able to establish a connection with him. As night fell, Sarah heard increased activity outside her room. Vehicles arrived and departed, and she could hear men talking in urgent voices. The sounds suggested that her captors were preparing for some kind of operation or responding to developments in the area. Through the small window, Sarah could see the lights of Fallujah in the distance. She tried to determine her exact location based on the view, but the unfamiliar angle made it difficult to orient herself. She estimated that she was being held in a building on the outskirts of the city, possibly in an area that American forces had not yet searched thoroughly. The second day of her captivity began with increased tension among her guards. Sarah could hear heated arguments in the hallway outside her room, and the tone of the conversations suggested that pressure was mounting on the group to make a decision about her fate. The man providing her medical care appeared more nervous during his morning visit. He checked her wounds quickly and left without making eye contact. Sarah sensed that the situation was becoming more unstable and that her time might be running out. Later that morning, Sarah heard the sound of helicopters in the distance. The aircraft seemed to be conducting search patterns, flying back and forth over the area. Her heart raced with hope that American forces might be looking for her, but she knew that the chances of them finding this specific building were slim. The helicopter sounds caused panic among her captors. Sarah could hear them moving equipment and discussing plans to relocate her to a different location. The prospect of being moved worried her because it would make rescue even more difficult and might put her in the hands of more radical insurgent factions. As the day progressed, Sarah noticed that her medical care became less frequent and more rushed. The man treating her wounds seemed distracted and fearful. She realized that the pressure from American search operations was creating instability within the insurgent group. The sounds of gunfire echoed in the distance throughout the afternoon, suggesting that American forces were engaged in combat operations nearby. Sarah knew that her fellow soldiers were risking their lives to find her, and this knowledge strengthened her determination to survive. During what would be her final night in captivity, Sarah heard her captors making preparations to abandon the building. They were loading vehicles and destroying documents that might provide intelligence to American forces. The activity suggested that they planned to move her before dawn. Sarah knew that being transferred to a new location would significantly reduce her chances of rescue. She needed to find a way to signal her position to American forces before her captors could move her. Despite her injuries and weakness, she began working to free herself from the restraints holding her to the medical table. The process was slow and painful, but Sarah managed to loosen the ties around her wrists. Her military training had included escape and evasion techniques, and she drew on this knowledge to work methodically despite her physical limitations. As the night wore on, the building became quieter as her captors completed their preparations for departure. Sarah could hear guards outside her door, but their attention seemed focused on the evacuation rather than watching her closely. Sarah managed to free one of her arms and began working on the restraints around her other wrist and ankles. The movement caused intense pain in her wounded shoulder, but she knew this might be her only opportunity to attempt an escape or signal for help. The sound of approaching helicopters grew louder as the night progressed. Sarah could tell that American search operations were intensifying in the area. The aircraft seemed to be moving in a systematic pattern, checking buildings and gathering intelligence about insurgent activities. Her captors were becoming increasingly agitated by the nearby military presence. Sarah could hear them arguing about whether to leave immediately or wait until the helicopters moved to another area. The disagreement created confusion and distraction that she hoped to exploit. Sarah succeeded in freeing her remaining restraints just as the sound of helicopters became very close to her building. Through the window, she could see searchlights sweeping across nearby structures. American forces were conducting a detailed search of the area, moving methodically from building to building. The opportunity she had been waiting for was finally presenting itself. Sarah knew that she was too weak and injured to escape the building on her own. but she might be able to signal her location to the searching American forces. Despite the severe pain in her wounds, Sarah managed to pull herself off the medical table and crawl toward the window. Every movement was agony, but the sound of American helicopters so close to her location gave her the strength to continue. As she reached the window, Sarah could see the lights of military aircraft conducting search operations just blocks away. She needed to find a way to attract their attention and signal that an American soldier was being held in this building. The sound of her captors preparing to move her was growing more urgent. Sarah realized that she had only minutes before they would discover her attempt to escape and either kill her or move her to a location where rescue would be impossible. Drawing on the last of her strength, Sarah began her desperate attempt to signal the approaching rescue forces, knowing that her survival depended on making contact with American troops before her captors could stop her. Lieutenant Commander Mark Stevens adjusted his night vision goggles as his SEAL team moved silently through the narrow streets of Fallujah. They had been conducting search operations for the past 18 hours, following intelligence reports about possible American hostages in the area. The mission had taken on special urgency when they learned that Captain Sarah Martinez, who had been declared dead 2 days earlier, might actually be alive and in enemy hands. The intelligence had come from Omar, the Iraqi translator who had worked with Sarah's unit. After 2 days of guilt and anguish over her apparent death, Omar had approached American forces with crucial information. He had heard rumors from local contacts that insurgents were holding an American female soldier in a building on the outskirts of the city. Stevens and his team were skeptical of the report initially. Sarah's body had supposedly been recovered and was already being prepared for transport back to the United States. However, the translator's desperate insistence and detailed knowledge of Sarah's appearance convinced military intelligence that the report warranted investigation. The SEAL team had been searching systematically through the suspected area for hours. They had already cleared dozen buildings without finding any trace of American prisoners. As dawn approached, Stevens was beginning to worry that the intelligence might be incorrect, or that they were simply too late. The team moved toward a cluster of buildings that matched the translator's description of the location where Sarah might be held. The structures appeared to be abandoned, but recent tire tracks in the dust suggested that vehicles had been there recently. Stevens signaled for his team to spread out and approach the buildings from multiple directions. They moved with practiced silence, using hand signals to coordinate their movements. The potential presence of an American hostage required them to be especially careful to avoid any action that might result in harm to a fellow soldier. As they approached the main building, Stevens noticed movement through one of the upper floor windows. Someone appeared to be signaling with a piece of white fabric, waving it back and forth in a pattern that seemed deliberate rather than random. The team leader used his rifle scope to get a better view of the window. Through the dim early morning light, he could see a figure moving weakly near the glass. The person appeared to be wearing what looked like American military clothing, though it was difficult to be certain from their current distance. Stevens made the decision to move closer to investigate the signaling. He left half his team in overwatch positions while taking 3 other SEALs toward the building. The structure appeared to be a former medical clinic or small hospital, which would explain the presence of medical equipment that Omar had mentioned in his reports. As they reached the base of the building, Stevens could hear sounds of activity inside. Voices were speaking in Arabic, and there seemed to be movement on the ground floor. The team needed to act quickly before the insurgents either discovered the approaching Americans or decided to harm their prisoner. The SEAL team split up to enter the building from multiple points simultaneously. Stevens and one teammate headed for the main entrance, while the other 2 moved toward a rear door. The goal was to secure the building and locate any hostages before the insurgents could react to their presence. Stevens breached the front door using explosive charges, creating a loud noise that would distract attention from his teammates entering through the back. The team moved swiftly through the ground floor, clearing rooms methodically while heading toward the staircase leading to the upper level. The sounds from upstairs became more urgent as the insurgents realized they were under attack. Stevens could hear shouting and the movement of furniture being dragged across the floor. The activity suggested that someone was trying to barricade themselves into a room, possibly with a hostage. The SEAL team reached the second floor and identified the room where the signaling had originated. They could hear a weak voice calling for help in English, confirming that an American was indeed being held in the building. The voice sounded female and matched the vocal characteristics that Omar had described for Sarah Martinez. Stevens positioned his team outside the door while calling out to identify himself as American military. The response from inside was weak but clear. It was Sarah, and she was alive but severely wounded. She warned that there were at least 2 armed insurgents in the building who had been preparing to move her to another location. The situation required immediate action. Sarah's condition sounded critical, and the presence of armed insurgents meant that any delay could result in her death. Stevens coordinated with his teammates to breach the door while minimizing risk to the hostage inside. The door was locked and reinforced, requiring the use of small explosive charges to break it open. Stevens warned Sarah to take cover as much as possible before initiating the breach. The explosion created a cloud of dust and debris, but it successfully opened the door for the rescue team. As the dust settled, Stevens could see Sarah lying near the window where she had been signaling. She was obviously in severe condition, with multiple bandages covering wounds on her arms, legs, and torso. Her face was pale and drawn, showing the effects of 2 days without proper medical care and nutrition. One of the insurgents was hiding behind an overturned medical table, armed with an assault rifle. Stevens engaged the threat immediately while his teammates secured the rest of the room. The firefight was brief but intense, ending when the insurgent was neutralized by precise shots from the SEAL team. A second insurgent had fled through a window onto the roof of an adjacent building. Stevens assigned one of his teammates to pursue while he focused on providing immediate medical aid to Sarah. Her condition was worse than they had expected, and she needed emergency treatment to survive transport to a medical facility. Sarah was conscious, but barely able to speak. She managed to provide Stevens with her name, rank, and unit information, confirming her identity as the soldier who had been declared dead 2 days earlier. The discovery that she was alive was both miraculous and deeply concerning, given her obvious medical needs. Stevens applied emergency first aid while calling for immediate medical evacuation. Sarah's wounds had reopened during her escape attempt, and she was losing blood at a dangerous rate. The SEAL medic worked frantically to stabilize her condition while preparing for the helicopter extraction. The medical evacuation helicopter arrived within minutes, having been standing by during the search operation. The flight crew immediately took over Sarah's medical care, starting IV fluids and administering medication to stabilize her vital signs during transport to the main military hospital. During the helicopter ride, Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness. When she was alert, she provided brief information about her captivity and the insurgent group that had been holding her. The intelligence would be valuable for future operations against the same network. At the military hospital, the medical team was shocked to see Sarah arrive alive. Her death had already been reported through official channels, and preparations had been made to return her body to the United States. The discovery that she had survived created confusion and required immediate communication with higher headquarters. The doctors who examined Sarah were amazed by her survival. The 11 gunshot wounds she had sustained should have been fatal, and her survival for 2 days without proper medical care was extraordinary. Her physical condition was still critical, but the fact that she was conscious and communicating gave the medical team hope for her recovery. Sarah underwent immediate surgery to repair damage from her multiple gunshot wounds. The operations took over 8 hours as surgeons worked to address injuries to her internal organs, bones, and blood vessels. The skill of the medical team and Sarah's own physical strength and determination contributed to the successful procedures. News of Sarah's rescue spread quickly through the military command structure. Her family in Texas, who had been grieving her reported death, received the incredible news that she was alive and receiving medical treatment. The emotional impact of learning that their daughter had survived was overwhelming for her parents. Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez, Sarah's commanding officer, was among the first to visit her in the hospital recovery room. He had been deeply affected by her apparent death and had spent the past 2 days writing letters of condolence to her family and preparing recommendations for posthumous honors. The reunion between Rodriguez and Sarah was emotional for both of them. Despite her weakened condition, Sarah was able to provide a detailed account of her capture, captivity, and eventual rescue. Her information proved valuable for military intelligence and helped identify the insurgent network responsible for the ambush. Omar, the translator who had provided the crucial intelligence leading to Sarah's rescue, was brought to the hospital to meet with her. The young Iraqi man had blamed himself for her apparent death and had risked his own life by approaching American forces with information about her possible survival. Sarah thanked Omar for his courage in providing the information that saved her life. She learned that he had spent 2 days gathering intelligence from his network of local contacts, refusing to accept that she was dead despite official reports. His persistence and dedication had been essential to her rescue. The investigation into how Sarah had been declared dead when she was actually alive revealed several factors that had contributed to the confusion. The intense firefight during her capture had made accurate casualty assessment difficult. The severe nature of her wounds and her unconscious condition had led medics to conclude that she had died from her injuries. Additionally, the insurgents had deliberately left false evidence at the scene to suggest that Sarah's body had been removed by enemy forces. This deception had contributed to the belief that she was dead rather than captured. The insurgent group had planned to use her as a bargaining chip, but had been forced to change their plans due to increased American search operations. Sarah's recovery took several months and required multiple surgeries to repair the damage from her gunshot wounds. She faced a long period of physical therapy to regain the use of her injured limbs and rebuild her strength. The psychological impact of her trauma also required professional counseling and support. Throughout her recovery, Sarah was supported by visits from her family, fellow soldiers, and military leadership. Her story of survival against impossible odds became an inspiration to other service members and a testament to the importance of never giving up hope in desperate situations. The SEAL team that rescued Sarah was recognized for their successful mission. Lieutenant Commander Stevens and his teammates received commendations for their skill and courage in conducting the dangerous rescue operation. The mission demonstrated the effectiveness of special operations forces in complex hostage situations. Sarah eventually returned to active duty, though in a different capacity that did not require deployment to combat zones. Her experience in captivity and her knowledge of insurgent tactics made her valuable as an intelligence analyst and trainer for other soldiers deploying to Iraq and Afghanistan. The building where Sarah had been held was thoroughly searched for intelligence about the insurgent network. Documents and equipment found at the site led to the identification and capture of several key leaders in the group responsible for the ambush and her captivity. Omar continued to work with American forces as a translator and intelligence source. His role in Sarah's rescue earned him the respect and gratitude of military personnel, and he eventually emigrated to the United States, where he continued to assist with counterterrorism operations. Sarah's story became part of military training programs used to teach soldiers about survival, evasion, resistance, and escape techniques. Her experience demonstrated the importance of maintaining hope and looking for opportunities even in the most desperate circumstances. The lessons learned from Sarah's capture and rescue led to improvements in search and rescue procedures for missing American personnel. New protocols were established to ensure more thorough verification of casualties and more intensive search operations for missing soldiers. Years later, Sarah continued to serve her country in various capacities, always carrying with her the memory of those 2 days when she fought for survival against overwhelming odds. Her story remained a powerful reminder of the courage and resilience of American military personnel serving in dangerous locations around the world. The friendship between Sarah and Omar endured long after the war in Iraq ended. Their shared experience during those critical days in Fallujah created a bond that transcended cultural and national differences, representing the possibility for understanding and cooperation even in times of conflict.